Hello everyone, myself Dr. S. Mohamed Nazeer. This class I'm going to teach you inflation and deflation. What is inflation? Inflation is a situation where general level of price is rising. Okay, inflation is a situation where general level of price is rising. 2 points should be noted here. Inflation means not merely high prices but rising prices. The rise in price should be sustained. If it is a temporary rise, then the situation is not called an inflationary situation. Okay, these two things should be there. The price should be continuously rise, then it is called inflation. Okay, the rising the price should be sustained, then it is called inflation. We can calculate inflation with the help of price index. The consumer price index, CPI. The consumer price index means the cost of a basket of consumer goods at a current market price relative to the cost of that bundle during a particular base year. Okay. GDP deflator is another price index measures the average price of components in GDP relative to base year. Okay. Let's see the different degrees of inflation. Okay, inflation can be categorized according to degree of severity: low inflation, galloping inflation, and hyperinflation. Let's see one by one. Low inflation. In this situation, price rises slowly and predictably. The annual inflation rate is single digit. People can trust money because in low inflation situation, money can retain its value. Okay, I repeat, the low inflation situation, money can retain its value. Some economists believed that a low rate of inflation is sometimes helpful to encourage producer to produce more. Okay, this is low inflation. Let's see what is galloping inflation. It is very high inflation, and the rate of inflation is double digit and sometimes triple digit % per year. The situation can emerge in different countries at the time of war, revolution, and other disturbing situation. In the situation of galloping inflation, serious economic distortions arise. Money loses its value rapidly. People hold goods, buy land and houses and gold rather than holding money. Financial market breakdowns and capital flows abroad. Okay, this is the galloping inflation. Let's see the hyperinflation. According to J.M. Keynes, as inflation proceeds and the real value of currency fluctuates widely from month to month, all permanent relation between debtors and creditors, which form the ultimate foundation of capitalism, become so utterly disordered as to be almost meaningless. And the process of wealth getting generates into game and a lottery. This is hyperinflation. Okay, these are the degrees of inflation. Let's see the quantity theory of money. According to classical economists, there is a positive relationship between the price level and the quantity of money. This hypothesis is called quantity theory of money. This predicts that changes in price level is proportionate changes in the quantity of money. If the quantity of money is doubled, the price level will double. It will not affect the output and the employment. This is the classical beliefs. This theory is called the quantity theory of money. There are different theories are there. Let's see these theories in our next videos. Let's see the modern inflation theory. Demand pull inflation. Okay, there are two types of inflations. Demand pull inflation, cost push inflation. Let's see one by one. Demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when aggregate demand in an economy exceeds aggregate supply. This theory developed by J.M. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, can be described with the help of the concept of inflationary gap. This can be defined as the excess of aggregate demand over aggregate supply at the level of full employment. This can be explained with the help of diagram. We measure consumption C, investment I, government expenditure G. C plus I plus G. Here the C plus I plus G on the vertical axis. On the vertical axis, on the output and income on the horizontal axis. C plus I plus G represents the aggregate demand curve. At point B, AD curve, aggregate demand curve cuts the aggregate supply curve. This is the 45-degree line curve. Okay. At a full employment level of output. Now, this is the full employment level of output. Okay. This is the aggregate demand curve. This is the aggregate supply curve. It is the equilibrium point. Now, suppose for any reason, aggregate demand rises over the aggregate supply. Okay. AD curve shift to C plus I plus G 1. But output cannot increase since already reaches the full employment level. So look here. So now the new equilibrium point. This is equilibrium point 1. Output cannot increase. So automatically this gap, the price will increase. Automatically this gap, the price will increase. Automatically this gap will arise. This AB is called a inflationary gap. As demand is more than the supply of commodity, prices of commodity increase. One of the causes of demandful inflation is the policy of deficit financing of the government. For financing the budget deficit, government prints money. This creates rapid growth of money in the economy and increase the aggregate demand. The demand pull inflation is explained with this diagram. Okay. Initial equilibrium was this point E, where aggregate demand was equals to aggregate supply. See, this is the aggregate demand curve, this is the aggregate supply curve, this is the equilibrium point, okay. And then, both are equal here. If the aggregate demand rises from some reasons, AD curve, this aggregate demand curve shift AD 1. The new equilibrium is this one. The price level will increase from P to P1. So, the price is increasing. So, this is called demand pull inflation. Let's see the cost push inflation. Rising cost is another causes behind inflation. This is called cost push inflation. Sometimes it leads to a situation where output falls. Economy shows down but the price level rises. This is called stagflation or inflation with stagnation. Okay, I repeat. Sometimes it leads to a situation where output falls. Economy shows down, but the price level rises. This is called stagflation or inflation with stagnation. Cost push inflation can be shown with the help of diagram. Look here, in this diagram explains the cost push inflation. So this is the aggregate demand curve, this is the aggregate supply curve, this is the equilibrium point, this is the price level. Due to the reason, the aggregate supply curve is increasing. Okay, for increase in the cost of production, the supply curve will shift from AS to AS1. Okay, the price level rises from P to P1. This is called a cost push inflation. Let's see the expected and unexpected inflation. Inflation may be two types: expected or anticipated, or unexpected or unanticipated. Okay, for example, over some decades, the general price level rose an average around 3% per year. Okay, this is called expected inflation. So we know that gradually, annually, the price will increase at 3%. People from an expected rate of inflation, which tends to persist until the shock causes it to move up or down. Unanticipated, okay, unexpected inflation is caused by some shocks like excess demand pull inflation, or shortage of supply, or increase in production cost. That is the cost push inflation. Okay, this is called the unanticipated inflation. unanticipated or unexpected inflation has much severe effects on the economy than expected inflation. Okay, let's see the social cost of inflation. Inflation refers to a rise in absolute price, which gets, see, look here, inflation refers to rise in absolute price which get reflected in the overall price index, not a change in relative price. Okay, inflation refers to rise in the absolute price, not a change in the relative price. But economics well-being depends on relative prices, not on the general price level. Okay, the social cost of inflation depends on its rate. The social cost of inflation depends on its rate. Mild inflation is less costly than hyperinflation. Okay, the mild inflation is less costly than hyperinflation. Only a persistent rise in price poses a social problem. Okay, the cost of expected inflation. The most serious consequences of expected inflation is the distortion created by the inflation on people's demand for money. This context, the following costs can be referred. Okay, see, I repeat, the most serious consequences of the expected inflation is the distortion created by the inflation of people's demand for money. Okay, in this context, the following cost can be referred. Number one, shoe leather cost. Shoe leather cost. Money loses its value due to inflation. Money loses its value due to inflation. For that reason, people hold lower money balance. So they are required to go to bank more frequently than when price remains stable. The inconvenience of reducing money holding is known as shoe leather cost of inflation. Okay, the inconvenience of reducing money holding is known as shoe leather cost of inflation. Shoes are very costly in Western countries. There is no scope for repairing shoes. So as people go to bank more and more frequently, they have to replace their shoes again and again at a high cost. This is called a shoe leather cost. The second one, menu cost. High inflation induces firms to change their printed prices every now and then. But frequent price changes create confusion among buyers and adversely affect consumer psychology and emotion. Price changes are also costly. There is need to print new prices, announces the price changes through newspapers and TV, commercials and distribute catalogs. These costs are known as menu cost. The truth is that the higher the rate of inflation, the more often eating houses have to print new menus. This is called a menu cost. Okay, now tax loss and tax liabilities. Tax loss and tax liabilities, which means the tax loss of most countries except where there is indexation, do not take into account of inflation. Inflation can alter the tax liabilities of individuals in ways not desired by the tax authorities. Okay, this is called the tax and the tax liabilities. The fourth one, the fourth social cost. Okay, the expected inflation. Inconvenience. Money is the measuring rod of everything. During inflation, it fails to perform this function because the unit of account itself changes. For example, during inflation, people cannot do proper financial planning. They do not know how much to consume, how much to save. This is the one of the social cost of inflation. Okay, what are the social costs of inflation? Shoe leather cost, menu cost, tax loss and tax liabilities, and the inconveniences. Okay, let's see the unexpected inflation. The cost of unexpected inflations. The main cost of unexpected inflation are redistribution of income in undesirable ways, and generation of uncertainties. The following points may be noted in this context. Income redistribution is one of the social cost of unexpected inflation. Let's see what is income redistribution. Unexpected inflation arbitrarily redistributes wealth among individuals. Since most loan agreements are made at a nominal rate, the most loan agreements are made at a nominal rate of interest, and there is no inflation clause, adjustment of nominal rate against the actual rate of inflation. Debtors gain and creditors lose if the actual rate of inflation turns out to be higher than the expected rate. But unexpectedly, the inflation is increasing, debtor gains, but creditors lose. If the rate of inflation falls below what people expect, the shoe is on the other foot. It is because the repayment is greater than what was expected by both the parties. People having fixed income, such as wage earners, pensioners, what we can say, the holders of the government bonds suffer loss of real income during this type of inflation. So this is called the income redistribution. The second one is the uncertainty. The greater is variability of the rate of inflation, the greater is uncertainty faced by the both debtors and the creditors. The unpredictable nature of high volatile rate of inflation hurts most risk adverse people who do not want to learn to live with inflation. They never developed any taste for uncertainty, which traders and spectators often love to cherish. In short, volatile inflation is something which is most people find unpalatable. Since they cannot digest it, they do not want to swallow it either. So, uncertainty. The uncertainty is one of the social cost of unexpected inflation. The next one is the variability. Finally, the high inflation, being high volatile and variable in nature, increase uncertainty of both lenders and borrowers by subjecting them arbitrarily and potentially large redistribution of wealth. These are the social cost of unexpected inflation. Let's see the anti-inflation policies. The anti-inflation policies. The anti-inflationary policy may be grouped under three headings: monetary policy, fiscal policy, and non-monetary policy. Let's see one by one. Monetary policy. The monetary policy refers to credit control policy of the central bank. The monetary policy works through affecting the supply of money, thereby affecting the rate of interest. Monetary policy is also known as the interest rate policy. The measures usually taken by the central bank for controlling the volume of credit are as follows. Number one, changes in the bank rate. Number two, changes in the reserve ratio to maintained by the commercial banks with the central bank. Open market operations, selective methods of credit control. The bank rate should be increased during the period of inflation. We know the inflation is the increasing in the prices. During this period of inflation, the bank rate should be increased. The increase in bank rate will increase the long-term market rate of interest, thereby discouraging investment. This will reduce the inflationary gap. Similarly, reserve ratio of the commercial banks will have to be increased during the period of inflation. When the reserve ratio is raised, this will reduce the excess reserves of the commercial banks, thereby reducing their credit creating capacity. The pressure of excess demand during the period of inflation results from excess purchasing power. This excess purchasing power can be eliminated by selling government securities in the open market. As a result, spenders would postpone their purchases of commodities and would purchase the government bonds. This will reduce the quantity of money in circulation. Similarly, to control credit in some selective sectors of the economy, to selective methods of credit control like regulation of margin requirements or regulation of consumer credits may be used. The main difficulty with the monetary policy is that these methods affect the economy's aggregate demand only indirectly. Okay, these monetary measures will affect the aggregate demand only indirectly. Hence, the result to be obtained by adopting monetary policy would require some time lag. Okay, this is one of the method to control the inflation, monetary policy. The second method is the fiscal policy. Let's see what is fiscal policy, how this fiscal policy is controlling the inflation. Fiscal policy can be used to check inflation. The fiscal policy refers to the income expenditure process of the government. Different fiscal parameters like the changes in the government expenditure, changes in transfer payments, changes in taxes or changes in public borrowing can directly affect the aggregate demand. During the period of inflation, the government can like the following steps. The government expenditure on goods and services should be reduced. Taxes remain the same, thereby having a surplus in the budget. A reduction in government expenditure directly reduces the aggregate demand. Okay, this is one of the way. The next one, taxes should be increased. Government expenditure remains the same. An increase in tax will reduce the disposable income of the public, thereby reducing the aggregate consumption expenditure. It should be noted that as anti-inflationary measures, direct taxes are superior to indirect taxes. Why? Because since indirect taxes can be shifted, imposition of indirect tax will lead to further increase in price level. Okay, that is the reason direct tax is superior than the indirect tax. So government want to increase the tax to control the inflation. The next one, the government should borrow from the public during the period of inflation by selling new government bonds. Government borrowing may also take from the compulsory saving. When people purchase government bonds, they surrender purchasing power which may otherwise have been spent on consumption and investment. Okay. Apart from the monetary and fiscal measures, non-monetary measures may also be adopted to control the inflation situation. The non-monetary measures includes output adjustment, wage policy, price control and rationing, etc. Inflation may rise because shortage of output. So to control inflation, the level of output should be increased in real terms. Okay, so increasing the price level because of shortage of output. So we have to increase the production. The volume of production should be increased. Similarly, to control an inflationary situation that arises from the cost side, attempts should be made to check the rate of interest in money wages. The measures to control price and rationing are actually short-term measures. Price control means fixation of legal upper limit. Mere price control may lead to creation of black market. Okay, this is one of the difficulty. Rationing to the highest number of consumer functions as a device of stabilizing consumer prices and assuring distributive justice. However, rationing by weak administration will lead to black market and corruption. Okay, these are the other measures other than monetary policy and fiscal policy. Different anti-inflationary policies should be regarded as competitive. They are rather complementary. All of them should be used at the same time to get the best result. Okay, let's see deflation and the deflationary gap. What is deflationary gap? What is deflation? Okay, decreasing in the price level. Okay, increasing the value of the money is called deflation. What is deflationary gap? An excess supply situation in an economy leads to continuous fall in price level, aggregate output and employment in an economy. Okay, this considered as economic deflation in any country. Thus, if the aggregate desired expenditure or the aggregate demand become less than the aggregate supply available at full employment level of output, there arises a deflationary gap. This diagram shows the deflationary gap. Okay, in this diagram, we see that at the full employment level of national output is OYF, present aggregate desired expenditure, okay, C plus I, becomes less than the aggregate desired expenditure required to maintain that full employment level of output by an amount of EF. This is the equilibrium because of reduction of the what we can say aggregate demand. This gap arises. This gap of EF shows the deflationary gap. Let's see the basic reasons for the emergence of deficient demand or deflationary gap. Number one, a fall in the aggregate desired private consumption expenditure. If there is a fall in the aggregate desired private consumption expenditure, each level of national output, then it will lead to a fall in aggregate demand in an economy. In fact, the people may be inclined to save more and consume less at each level of national output. That is the reason aggregate demand falls. This deflationary gap arises. The next one, a fall in aggregate desired private investment expenditure. Again, if there is a fall in the aggregate desired private investment expenditure in an economy at each level of national output, then the aggregate demand will fall. This may happen due to black business prospects in an economy. If we now consider an open economy with positive government intervention in economic activities, then we get the following additional reasons for emergence of a deficient demand situation or a deflationary gap. Number one, a fall in net export earnings. A fall in net export earnings, the aggregate demand will fall. A fall in government expenditure and increase in tax rates, it will affect the aggregate demand. So the inflation gap will arise. The consequences of a deficient demand situation. A filling up of the stock of inventories. A fall in level of output and employment. Because of aggregate demand falls, the level of output and employment will fall. A fall in general price level. Okay, these are the effects, consequences of a deficient demand situation. Measures to combat the deficient demand condition. If an economy suffers from the problem of a deficient demand or deflationary gap, then some measures are to be adopted to raise the level of aggregate demand in the economy. The role of fiscal policy or the budgetary policy of the government for the correction of such a deficient demand situation was the first emphasized by John Maynard Keynes. The basic instruments of the fiscal policies. The government should increase the expenditure. Government should reduce their taxes. Government should give the subsidies and transfer payments. Public debt and public borrowing and deficit financing. It will increase the aggregate demand. Okay. Then the deflationary gap will reduce. What is deficit financing? When the aggregate expenditure exceeds aggregate revenue of the government, then there arises a deficit in the government budget. The method of financing this deficit is called deficit financing. Government can take loan from the central bank to cover this budget deficit. The central bank can print money against such government securities. So the supply of money will increase in the economy. The purchasing power of people will rise. As a result, the consumption expenditure of the people will rise. So the problem of deficit demand can be solved. Okay.